In the late 19th century, when the world was rapidly shifting from an age of lamps and steam engines to an era fueled by industrial growth and mechanical innovation, one company rose from almost nothing to become the single most dominant energy force on the planet. And that company was Standard Oil, built by the ambitious and calculated mind of John D. Rockefeller, a man who understood business efficiency, cost control, and market strategy with an intensity the world had never seen. As oil became essential for lighting, heating, lubrication, and later transportation, Rockefeller recognized that the key to power was not just producing oil, but controlling every step of its journey, from the moment it was pumped out of the ground to the moment it reached the consumer. Through aggressive pricing, strategic partnerships, secret railroad rebates, and a relentless focus on efficiency, Standard Oil refined, transported, and sold oil cheaper than almost anyone else. And by the 1880s, the company controlled nearly 90% of all oil refined in the United States. This was not a small dominance. It was a total restructuring of an entire industry under one corporate empire. Rockefeller's model of vertical integration allowed Standard Oil to own wells, pipelines, tank cars, storage facilities, refineries, and distribution networks, which meant competitors simply could not match the scale or price. As Standard Oil expanded outward, foreign markets in Europe, Asia, and South America increasingly became dependent on American kerosene produced under the Rockefeller system, turning the company into a global powerhouse whose influence stretched across nations and oceans. But as its influence expanded, so did the opposition. Independent oilmen accused Rockefeller of unfair tactics. Journalists wrote exposes on corporate abuses, and the American public began to fear that no single private company should have the power to dictate prices, control transportation networks, and effectively manage a global commodity essential for everyday life. The government took notice, and the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 gave legal grounds to challenge monopolies. After 2 decades of investigations and trials, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1911 that Standard Oil had violated antitrust laws and ordered it to be broken into 34 separate companies. What seemed at first like the end of an empire was, in reality, the beginning of a new one, because many of those companies grew into the giants we know today: Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, and others. Instead of one titan dominating global oil, the world now had a family of powerful corporate descendants, collectively known as the Seven Sisters: Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Gulf Oil, Texaco, Royal Dutch Shell, and British Petroleum. For decades, these corporations became the new rulers of oil, controlling exploration, production, refining, and pricing across continents. They negotiated with governments, influenced geopolitics, secured exclusive drilling rights, funded large-scale research, and shaped the energy infrastructure of the 20th century. Their influence was so large that in many oil-producing countries, the Seven Sisters were seen as foreign powers operating inside national borders. However, as time passed, new forces began to challenge their control. After World War II, nationalism grew, especially in the Middle East, Latin America, and parts of Africa. Governments realized that multinational corporations were reaping enormous profits from their natural resources, while local populations remained poor. This anger fueled a new movement, reclaiming energy sovereignty. Countries like Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Venezuela, and Libya began to nationalize their oil industries. By taking ownership of oil wells, rigs, refineries, and export terminals, they reduced the influence of Western corporations. In 1960, these nations formed OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, to collectively manage production levels, stabilize prices, and regain control over their resources. With the rise of OPEC came the fall of the Seven Sisters' dominance. The turning point occurred during the 1973 oil crisis, when Arab OPEC members cut supply to countries supporting Israel, sending global oil prices skyrocketing and exposing how vulnerable Western nations were without control over foreign oil. The once mighty Western companies, which had dictated prices for decades, suddenly had to negotiate with newly empowered governments and national oil firms. Over the following decades, Saudi Aramco, Kuwait Petroleum, Petronas, Petrobras, and other national companies grew larger and more influential, surpassing Western companies in reserves and production capacity. The crown of global oil dominance had quietly moved from private corporations to nation-owned giants that controlled the biggest and cheapest oil fields on Earth. Meanwhile, the Western oil majors shifted their strategies, focusing on complex offshore drilling, technological innovation, petrochemicals, and mergers to stay competitive. Exxon merged with Mobil, Chevron absorbed Texaco, BP acquired Amoco, and a new map of corporate oil power emerged. But even with their scale, they no longer controlled global supply the way Standard Oil once had. Technological disruption also reshaped the landscape. Hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling unlocked shale oil in the United States, making the U.S. a top global oil producer again. But competition still intensified as renewable energy, electric vehicles, and climate policies began influencing markets. Environmental concerns placed additional pressure on oil companies, driving them to diversify, reduce emissions, or shift toward natural gas and renewables. Public opinion also evolved. Oil companies faced criticism for spills, emissions, and climate impacts, and governments introduced stricter regulations. The industry that once ruled without question now faced challenges from multiple sides: economic, political, environmental, and technological. Yet despite all this disruption, the story of Standard Oil remains a timeless lesson in global business history. It shows how absolute dominance can be achieved through strategy, efficiency, and innovation, but also how massive power attracts resistance, scrutiny, and regulation. It shows that industries evolve, and the leaders of one era may not remain leaders in the next. It shows that control over a critical resource can shape geopolitics for generations. And it reveals a powerful truth. No matter how large a company becomes, change is inevitable. Standard Oil rose by understanding the future of energy, and it fell because the world demanded a more balanced system. The Seven Sisters rose because they inherited Standard Oil's assets and global reach, but they lost their crown because nations reclaimed their resources. National oil companies rose because they controlled the cheapest oil fields, but now even they face challenges from shifting energy technologies and global climate goals. The crown of global oil power has changed hands many times, from Rockefeller's monopoly to the Seven Sisters, corporate empire to state-owned giants, and now toward a more fragmented and uncertain future where technology policy and sustainability will decide the next rulers of energy. And as history has shown, the most powerful player today might be the one struggling tomorrow, making the rise and fall of global oil empires one of the most dramatic business stories ever written. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the incredible journey of the company that once ruled global oil and eventually lost its crown, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to HistoriNomica, because every day we bring you the hidden financial histories, forgotten economic battles, and dramatic corporate stories that shaped the modern world.